As the last ice age began its final retreat around 12,000 BCE, the land that would become Scotland was largely inhospitable, dominated by glaciers, tundra, and sparse vegetation. The retreating ice sheets reshaped the landscape, carving valleys, depositing moraines, and forming freshwater lochs and rivers. Sea levels were lower than today, exposing expanses of land such as Doggerland, which temporarily connected Scotland to continental Europe. These changing conditions created a mosaic of environments: rocky coasts, fertile river plains, and dense forests emerging from the thaw. Archaeological and geological evidence suggests that humans began to exploit these new landscapes as hunter-gatherer groups gradually expanded northward into Scotland, adapting to its seasonal extremes and diverse terrain. Early evidence of human activity is found at sites including Halburn Farm in southern Scotland and Cramond near modern Edinburgh. At Halburn Farm, flint tools such as microliths demonstrate the presence of mobile groups skilled in hunting and foraging. Hearths and fire-cracked stones indicate controlled use of fire for cooking and warmth, essential for survival in a climate still subject to cold periods. Cramond, situated on the Firth of Forth, provides insight into coastal subsistence strategies, with evidence of shellfish gathering, fishing, and the hunting of terrestrial animals. These sites reveal a pattern of seasonal movement, with groups shifting between inland forests and coastal areas depending on resource availability. Archaeologists note that these communities were small, often consisting of extended family groups, and lacked permanent dwellings, reflecting a highly adaptive lifestyle finely tuned to local ecology. Beyond subsistence, Mesolithic populations in Scotland engaged with their environment in ways that would shape later social patterns. The organization of hunting parties, the choice of seasonal camps, and the management of tool production suggest emerging forms of social coordination. Although there is no evidence of formal political structures, these behaviors imply shared knowledge, mutual dependence, and strategies for resource management. Sites across Mesolithic Britain, when compared, indicate a broader network of cultural exchange, including the sharing of lithic technology and possibly symbolic practices. The use of similar tool types from southern England to northern Scotland reflects the movement of ideas alongside people, connecting Scotland to the wider prehistoric landscape of northwest Europe. Climatic and environmental factors played a central role in human adaptation. Pollen analysis and sediment cores indicate a gradual reforestation following glacial retreat, with birch, pine, and later deciduous species dominating lowland areas. Rising sea levels and shifting coastlines required flexible settlement strategies and encouraged maritime skills. In this context, the earliest Scottish inhabitants demonstrated a remarkable capacity for innovation, including crafting composite tools and exploiting aquatic resources, which would later influence agricultural and settlement practices. By observing the rhythms of nature, these early communities established seasonal patterns of exploitation that persisted for millennia, laying a foundation for the later development of permanent settlements and social hierarchies. The evidence of human presence in Scotland during the Mesolithic also sheds light on broader population movements in post-glacial Europe. Genetic studies of ancient remains suggest connections with populations in Scandinavia and southern Europe, indicating migration routes along coasts and river valleys. These movements were facilitated by the temporary land bridges and lower sea levels of the period, enabling both the spread of technology and the exchange of cultural practices. In practical terms, the use of portable tools, exploitation of diverse food sources, and seasonal mobility all reflect strategies to survive at the edge of a newly thawed world, where climate, landscape, and ecology were in constant flux. By establishing seasonal camps, refining hunting and gathering techniques, and creating networks of knowledge, these early human groups set in motion patterns of land use, resource management, and social organization that would influence subsequent prehistoric periods. Their adaptive strategies, observed through stone tools, hearths, and food remains, demonstrate that survival in early Scotland required ingenuity, cooperation, and a deep understanding of the environment. These foundations paved the way for the Neolithic transition, when agriculture and permanent settlement would transform the region's social and ecological landscape, establishing the first enduring forms of societal complexity. Permanent settlement patterns, coastal exploitation, and coordinated group strategies developed during this Mesolithic period created a continuity of human activity in Scotland, forming the conditions necessary for the later advent of farming. By observing the landscape, exploiting seasonal resources, and coordinating social labor, early populations laid a durable foundation for experimentation with domesticated plants and animals. In this way, Scotland's first inhabitants exemplified human adaptability, connecting environmental opportunity with cultural innovation, and marking the beginning of an enduring human presence on the land that would become the Scottish nation. By around 4000 BCE, Scotland entered the Neolithic period, marked by the introduction of agriculture, permanent settlement, and profound changes in social and environmental organization. Farming arrived gradually, likely through migration or cultural diffusion from continental Europe, bringing domesticated plants such as wheat and barley, along with animals including cattle, sheep, and pigs. Archaeological and paleo-environmental evidence indicates that these early farmers actively modified the landscape, clearing forests for fields and pastures. Pollen cores from lowland valleys show significant shifts in vegetation, confirming widespread deforestation and cultivation. The resulting surplus of food allowed for population growth and greater sedentism, enabling communities to remain in one location for extended periods and to engage in specialized activities beyond subsistence. Key sites such as Skara Brae and Orkney provide exceptional insight into Neolithic domestic life. Skara Brae's stone-built houses, with built-in furniture and hearths, demonstrate long-term occupation and careful planning. Unlike Mesolithic temporary camps, these settlements reveal advanced construction techniques adapted to a harsh environment. The use of stone, rather than timber, indicates both resource availability and the need for durable structures in windswept coastal areas. Similar examples across northern Scotland suggest shared building traditions, reflecting communication and cultural cohesion among geographically dispersed communities. The organization required for such settlements implies a degree of social coordination, even without centralized authority. Beyond domestic structures, Neolithic Scotland is notable for its monumental architecture, including Maeshowe, the Callanish stone circles, and various chambered cairns. These constructions, often aligned with solar and lunar cycles, indicate sophisticated knowledge of astronomy and cosmology. They were built collaboratively, requiring labor coordination, planning, and sustained effort over years or decades. The purpose of these monuments was less defensive and more ceremonial, suggesting that symbolic expression and communal ritual were central to Neolithic life. Archaeologists interpret these structures as markers of social cohesion, spiritual belief, and territorial identity, rather than evidence of hierarchical states. The investment in such monuments demonstrates that early Scottish societies valued collective ritual and cosmological observation as foundational to their communities. Subsistence strategies continued to combine agriculture with residual foraging and hunting. Faunal remains reveal the management of domesticated species alongside continued exploitation of wild animals and fish, ensuring dietary diversity. Crop cultivation relied on seasonal knowledge and soil management, including basic crop rotation and field preparation, as indicated by sediment analysis. These practices supported population stability and allowed some members of the community to specialize in tasks such as tool production, pottery, or monument construction. In turn, this division of labor created social differentiation and opportunities for ritual leadership, laying the groundwork for more complex societal organization in the Bronze Age. Trade and long-distance exchange also began to emerge during this period. Evidence from Orkney and the Hebrides shows the circulation of stone axes, polished tools, and ornamental items, suggesting that networks of contact facilitated both economic and cultural exchange. These interactions contributed to shared technological innovations and the dissemination of symbolic forms, further strengthening regional cohesion. By integrating subsistence, settlement, ritual, and exchange, Neolithic communities created enduring social systems that could support both population growth and cultural expression. The Neolithic Revolution in Scotland illustrates the interplay between environmental adaptation, technological innovation, and social coordination. The combination of farming, animal husbandry, permanent settlements, and monumental construction reflects a society capable of complex planning without centralized political authority. Seasonal rhythms, resource management, and cooperative labor ensured community survival while enabling spiritual and symbolic expression through monuments. By establishing agricultural stability, these early Scottish societies laid the foundation for subsequent developments in metallurgy, trade, and hierarchical leadership, bridging the gap between simple foraging groups and the emerging Bronze Age civilizations that would follow. Permanent agricultural settlements, combined with ritualized communal architecture, transformed human engagement with the Scottish landscape. The Neolithic period represents a critical moment when environmental manipulation, surplus production, and social coordination converged, producing both material and cultural legacies. These innovations directly set the stage for later technological advances, population expansion, and the increasingly complex social hierarchies that would characterize the Bronze and Iron Ages. By approximately 2500 BCE, Scotland had transitioned into the Bronze Age, marked by the introduction of metalworking technology that transformed daily life, subsistence, and social organization. Archaeological evidence demonstrates the production and use of bronze tools, weapons, and ornaments, often crafted from copper and tin sourced through long-distance trade networks connecting Scotland with Ireland, Wessex, and continental Europe. Hoards of axes, daggers, and decorative items indicate both practical utility and social signaling, suggesting that material culture played a key role in establishing status and group identity. Bronze metallurgy required specialized skills, leading to craft specialization and the emergence of individuals or families recognized for technical knowledge. Settlement patterns during this period remained largely rural, but the construction of roundhouses and the development of hill forts illustrate evolving defensive and communal strategies. Roundhouses, often circular structures with wattle-in daub walls and thatched roofs, accommodated extended families and demonstrated adaptive design for local climates. Hill forts, located on elevated terrain, served as centers of regional control, refuge, and status display rather than urban hubs. The distribution of these sites indicates the emergence of regional power centers with localized influence, reflecting a social landscape organized around kinship, resource control, and martial capability rather than centralized political authority. Trade networks expanded considerably during the Bronze Age. Evidence of imported metal and finished goods, along with stylistic similarities in ceramics and ornaments, points to sustained interaction with neighboring regions. Such networks facilitated not only the exchange of raw materials and finished products, but also the transmission of technological knowledge and cultural practices. The ability to obtain and control these resources reinforced the status of local elites and contributed to the development of distinct tribal identities. These networks also connected Scotland to broader European trends, including innovations in metal casting and ceremonial artifact production. By the Late Bronze Age and into the Iron Age, beginning around 800 BCE, iron replaced bronze as the dominant material for tools and weapons. Iron technology permitted stronger, more durable implements and facilitated more intensive agriculture and warfare. The Iron Age also witnessed the expansion of fortified settlements and the consolidation of warrior culture. Tribes, such as the groups later identified by Roman sources as the Caledonians, maintained autonomous territorial control and engaged in intertribal competition. Archaeological evidence, including weapon caches, defensive structures, and ritual deposits, illustrates that martial skill and territorial defense were central to social organization. Despite these developments, urbanization remained limited, with few, if any, settlements resembling towns. Instead, communities were dispersed, kin-based, and adaptive to local ecological conditions. These tribal societies maintained complex cultural identities without forming unified states. Leadership was often personal and based on kinship, martial prowess, and control of resources rather than hereditary monarchy or bureaucracy. Ritual practices, burial customs, and monumental structures, such as burial cairns and hilltop enclosures, reinforced group cohesion and distinct identity. Material culture, coupled with localized power structures, facilitated the emergence of strong tribal consciousness that defined social and political life in prehistoric Scotland. The Bronze and Iron Ages thus established a pattern of regionalism, technological innovation, and cultural differentiation that would characterize Scotland up to the Roman period. Metalworking, trade networks, and defensive settlements created both economic and social stratification, while tribal loyalties preserved autonomy and resilience. These developments prepared Scotland's peoples for eventual contact with a major external imperial power, setting the stage for the confrontation and cultural exchange that would occur with the Romans in the 1st century CE. In the late 1st century CE, Roman expansion reached the northernmost regions of Britain, bringing the legions into contact with the peoples of what is now southern Scotland. Governor Gnaeus Julius Agricola led campaigns northward from the Roman province of Britannia, seeking to extend Roman control beyond the Fourth Clyde line. Archaeological and historical sources, including Tacitus's account, describe a series of skirmishes, fortifications, and temporary camps constructed as the Romans advanced into Caledonia. One of the most notable military engagements, the Battle of Mons Graupius around 83 CE, saw Roman forces confront a confederation of northern tribes. While Tacitus records a Roman victory, the outcome did not result in sustained occupation, as logistical challenges, terrain, and resilient local resistance limited the empire's capacity to maintain control. Roman strategy in Scotland focused on establishing fortifications and controlling key routes rather than integrating the region fully into the provincial system. Temporary forts, marching camps, and signal stations were constructed to secure supply lines and assert military presence. Excavations at sites such as Inchtuthil, Cramond, and Stregeeth reveal evidence of Roman construction techniques, imported pottery, and coinage, demonstrating that Roman material culture reached local populations. These installations facilitated not only military oversight but also limited trade and cultural exchange, allowing northern communities to access Roman goods while maintaining political autonomy. Archaeological evidence shows that some Scottish groups engaged in selective adoption of Roman practices, such as metalworking and coin use, without succumbing to full Romanization. Hadrian's Wall, constructed in the early 2nd century CE under Emperor Hadrian, represents the first major imperial boundary across northern Britain. Stretching from the Solway Firth to the Tyne, the wall marked a strategic frontier rather than a line of conquest. Its purpose was to control movement, collect taxes, and manage interactions with northern tribes. Later, the Antonine Wall, built under Antoninus Pius around 142 CE, briefly extended Roman influence further north into the central belt of Scotland. Forts such as those at Bar Hill and Rough Castle illustrate that Rome could project power, but sustaining these positions proved difficult due to challenging terrain, supply constraints, and persistent tribal resistance. Within a few decades, Roman forces retreated to Hadrian's Wall, abandoning the more northern line, indicating the limits of imperial ambition in the region. The presence of Rome in Scotland produced lasting but localized effects. Archaeological evidence of imported pottery, glass, and metalwork suggests that trade networks expanded, allowing northern tribes to acquire goods and ideas from the empire. Roman coins and artifacts found in tribal settlements indicate participation in broader economic systems, while defensive structures and hill forts reflect adaptations to Roman pressure. Cultural interactions were selective and pragmatic. Communities adopted technologies or practices that enhanced survival or status but resisted political assimilation. This selective engagement demonstrates the resilience and autonomy of northern societies in the face of a powerful external force. Despite military incursions, permanent Roman control over Scotland was never achieved. The difficulties of terrain, climate, and logistical support, combined with determined tribal resistance, prevented full integration into the empire. Rome's presence, while influential in certain regions and among particular groups, ultimately highlighted the limits of imperial power in peripheral zones. The failure to conquer Caledonia left enduring power vacuums, allowing indigenous groups to maintain autonomy and develop distinctive identities in the north. The legacy of Roman contact was therefore less about domination and more about selective exchange, frontier negotiation, and the emergence of a northern periphery that would influence subsequent social and political developments. The Roman campaigns and subsequent frontier settlements set a precedent for the interaction of external empires with northern Scotland. The construction of walls, forts, and roads created physical and symbolic boundaries, while trade and selective adoption of Roman material culture demonstrated the adaptability of local societies. Although Rome withdrew, its temporary presence reshaped northern identities, established new patterns of settlement and defense, and created networks that would persist into the post-Roman period. This environment of partial contact and persistent independence laid the foundation for emerging tribal and later medieval polities in Scotland. After the Roman legions withdrew from northern Britain in the early 5th century CE, Scotland entered a period of political fragmentation and cultural diversification. Without a centralized authority, the region was divided among a variety of groups, each maintaining distinct social structures, territories, and identities. In the northeast and east, the Picts emerged as a dominant cultural and political presence. Archaeological evidence, including fortified settlements, hill forts, and Pictish symbol stones, indicates complex leadership structures, with regional chieftains or kings exercising authority over localized communities. These symbols, often carved in stone with intricate motifs, suggest not only social hierarchy, but also ritual and territorial significance, reflecting a society capable of both defense and symbolic expression without the framework of a centralized state. In the south and southwest, Brittonic polities maintained continuity with the Romanized cultures of southern Britain. Kingdoms such as Strathclyde, along the Clyde Valley, operated within fortified settlements and hilltop enclosures, preserving administrative and martial traditions inherited from late Roman Britain. Material culture, including imported goods and metalwork, demonstrates that these polities participated in broader trade networks and maintained contact with neighboring regions. Despite the absence of imperial oversight, Brittonic rulers exercised control over land and resources, balancing warfare with alliances to maintain relative stability in a fragmented landscape. Along the western seaboard, Gaelic settlers from Ireland established the Kingdom of Dalriada, encompassing parts of Argyll and the Western Isles. These Gaelic-speaking communities introduced new cultural and linguistic elements while interacting with existing Pictish and Brittonic populations. Archaeological sites and early inscriptions indicate patterns of settlement, agriculture, and maritime mobility, highlighting the importance of coastal and riverine routes for communication and trade. Dalriada's kin-based structure emphasized familial authority and warrior networks rather than centralized bureaucracy, illustrating how political organization adapted to both geography and social norms. Religious development during this period was also decentralized but increasingly influential. Christianity spread through monastic networks rather than top-down conversion, with early monastic sites such as Iona and Whithorn serving as centers of learning, worship, and cultural cohesion. Missionaries and monks established monasteries that functioned as educational and religious hubs, facilitating literacy, record-keeping, and the transmission of religious practice. The spread of Christianity across Pictish, Brittonic, and Gaelic territories created shared ideological frameworks that could unite disparate groups, even in the absence of centralized kingship. This religious cohesion laid the groundwork for later political integration and cultural continuity. Trade, warfare, and kinship networks maintained social stability and identity during this fragmented era. Fortified hilltops and coastal settlements reflect both defensive concerns and the need for territorial markers, while archaeological evidence of imported goods indicates engagement with wider networks in Ireland, northern Britain, and continental Europe. The persistence of distinctive languages, artistic styles, and material culture demonstrates that identity was maintained through local governance, ritual practice, and intergroup interaction rather than through imperial or centralized structures. The post-Roman period in Scotland thus illustrates the capacity of regional communities to sustain identity, governance, and culture in the absence of a unifying authority. The Picts, Britons, and Gaelic settlers each developed systems suited to their environment and social structures, while religious networks provided common values and facilitated communication across regions. This fragmented landscape, shaped by geography, kinship, and belief, set the stage for the emergence of more cohesive kingdoms and cultural synthesis in the early medieval period, where shared religion would increasingly function as a unifying force across northern and western Scotland. By the mid-6th century CE, Christianity had begun to establish a significant presence in Scotland, largely through the efforts of missionaries and monastic communities rather than military conquest. Among the most influential figures was St. Columba, an Irish monk who founded the monastery of Iona in 563 CE. Iona became a central hub for religious practice, learning, and cultural exchange, serving both Gaelic and Pictish communities across northern and western Scotland. Archaeological evidence, including inscribed stones, early Christian crosses, and monastic ruins, indicates that Iona and similar sites functioned as centers of education, craftsmanship, and literacy, preserving both religious texts and elements of classical knowledge. The spread of Christianity through these networks facilitated communication, record-keeping, and the standardization of religious practice in regions previously divided by tribal and linguistic differences. Monastic communities played a critical role in integrating diverse societies. By establishing scriptoria, monks produced manuscripts, chronicles, and legal documents that reinforced both religious and secular authority. Literacy, once limited to elite circles, became more widely associated with ecclesiastical institutions, enabling the creation and preservation of records that would later serve as foundations for governance and diplomacy. Kings and local rulers frequently leveraged these religious institutions to legitimize their authority, commissioning monasteries or granting lands to clergy as a demonstration of piety and political acumen. In this way, Christianity became intertwined with the mechanisms of power, offering rulers a means to consolidate influence without resorting to warfare. The cultural impact of Christian monasteries extended beyond literacy and administration. Monastic centers facilitated artistic expression through illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, and stone carving. The exchange of ideas and artisans between monasteries created networks of shared artistic and religious traditions, linking distant communities across Scotland and Ireland. These shared cultural practices contributed to a sense of common identity, reinforcing the bonds between Pictish, Brittonic, and Gaelic groups despite political fragmentation. Religious observance, festivals, and pilgrimage created additional points of connection, embedding Christianity into the rhythm of daily life and local governance. Christianity also enhanced diplomatic relations among rival kingdoms. Monks and clerics often acted as intermediaries, negotiating truces, marriages, and alliances between tribal leaders. Their spiritual authority provided a neutral framework for dispute resolution, allowing communities to coordinate without the constant recourse to armed conflict. Through these religious networks, Scotland experienced a gradual process of cultural integration, where shared beliefs and practices could bridge political and linguistic divides. The influence of figures like St. Columba illustrates how soft power, grounded in faith, education, and ritual, could achieve cohesion where military campaigns had failed. The adoption of Christianity established both ideological and practical frameworks that would shape early medieval Scotland. Monastic centers preserved knowledge, promoted literacy, and facilitated diplomacy, while kings used religion to legitimize rule and consolidate authority. By creating networks of shared belief and cultural exchange, Christianity provided the foundations for political integration and social cohesion. This spiritual infrastructure enabled emerging Scottish kingdoms to coordinate governance, communicate across regions, and develop institutions capable of sustaining larger, more complex polities. The spread of Christianity in early Scotland demonstrates the capacity of religious institutions to unify diverse populations through education, ritual, and cultural exchange. Monastic networks created enduring connections among previously independent kingdoms, offering a model of influence and authority distinct from military conquest. These developments prepared the ground for the formation of more cohesive political structures in subsequent centuries, as shared belief systems became a central mechanism for consolidating power and shaping a distinctly Scottish identity. The emergence of the Kingdom of Alba in the mid-9th century represents a pivotal moment in Scotland's history, often associated with the reign of Kenneth MacAlpin, traditionally dated to around 843 CE. Early medieval chronicles portray MacAlpin as a unifying figure who merged the Pictish and Gaelic peoples under a single crown, yet modern scholarship emphasizes a more gradual process of consolidation rather than a sudden, singular event. Archaeological evidence, linguistic patterns, and place name studies suggest that Gaelic language and customs increasingly dominated political and cultural life over successive generations, reflecting the complex interactions between Pictish elites and incoming or neighboring Gaelic groups. The historical record for this period is sparse and frequently mediated by later monastic chroniclers, who often presented the unification of Picts and Gaels as a deliberate, divinely sanctioned act. Contemporary evidence, however, indicates a pattern of strategic alliances, intermarriage among elite families, and the absorption of Pictish territories through negotiation, rather than outright conquest. Material culture, including fortified sites, ceremonial objects, and regional settlement patterns, suggests continuity in local governance alongside gradual integration into broader political structures. The transition from a network of independent Pictish kingdoms to a consolidated realm required careful management of both internal hierarchies and regional loyalties. Kenneth MacAlpin's reign also illustrates the growing influence of Gaelic institutions and customs. Gaelic language became increasingly prominent in royal administration and courtly practice, influencing legal codes, oral traditions, and social organization. Ecclesiastical structures, particularly monasteries and clerical networks, supported this integration by fostering literacy, recording genealogies, and providing ideological reinforcement for kingship. Monastic sources, though often retrospective, highlight the role of the Church in legitimizing rulership and smoothing the fusion of distinct cultural traditions. By promoting Gaelic norms, MacAlpin and his successors established a common framework for governance that would endure in Alba for centuries. The consolidation of Alba required attention to defense and territorial control. Hill forts, royal centers, and strategic settlements were used to assert authority and monitor regional activity. Archaeological surveys reveal the maintenance of older Pictish fortifications alongside newly established royal sites, suggesting continuity in military organization while adapting to the changing political landscape. Control over key routes, river crossings, and coastal access facilitated communication and allowed the monarchy to project influence across disparate regions. These early administrative efforts formed the basis of the kingdom's enduring stability, even as external threats from Norse invaders and neighboring polities persisted. While Kenneth MacAlpin is often remembered as a single unifying figure, the evidence points to a protracted process in which Gaelic culture gradually absorbed Pictish structures, creating a hybrid political and social system. Regional identities persisted, and local elites retained considerable influence, but the overarching authority of the Alba monarchy provided cohesion and direction. The development of Alba illustrates how early medieval kingdoms could emerge through negotiation, cultural integration, and strategic alliance rather than solely through military conquest or charismatic leadership. The reign of Kenneth MacAlpin thus represents both symbolic and practical foundations for a unified Scottish kingdom. Gaelic language, monastic influence, and the integration of Pictish territories created the conditions for centralized governance, while retaining regional diversity. This early consolidation set the stage for the establishment of administrative structures, royal succession practices, and the legal and military institutions necessary to manage a unified realm. Alba's emergence demonstrates that the creation of Scotland was a process spanning generations, shaped by diplomacy, culture, and strategic leadership rather than a single decisive moment. Between the 9th and 11th centuries, the Kingdom of Alba underwent significant political consolidation, as successive kings extended authority over southern territories and established enduring systems of governance. This period saw the development of legal frameworks, kinship-based landholding, and mechanisms for collecting tribute, all of which reinforced royal power while accommodating existing regional structures. Land tenure was typically organized around familial groups, with local leaders responsible for administering estates and ensuring loyalty to the king. Kinship law governed inheritance, dispute resolution, and the transfer of rights, embedding social cohesion within broader political structures. These arrangements allowed the monarchy to exercise influence across a geographically diverse and often rugged landscape. Viking incursions during this period profoundly shaped both external and internal dynamics. Coastal and island communities faced repeated raiding from Norse forces, which targeted settlements, monasteries, and trade centers. Archaeological evidence of fortified sites, such as Brock adaptations and coastal defenses, demonstrates local responses to these pressures. While Viking activity threatened stability, it also reinforced royal authority inland, as kings were increasingly relied upon to organize defense, negotiate alliances, and coordinate military responses. In effect, external threats accelerated internal unity by creating shared imperatives for protection and governance, compelling regional elites to recognize the benefits of centralized coordination. Royal administration expanded through networks of subordinate nobles and local officials who oversaw tribute collection and legal enforcement. Tribute could include livestock, grain, labor, or military service, and its management reinforced hierarchical relationships between the king and regional leaders. Kings also convened assemblies, sometimes referred to as tings, to adjudicate disputes, formalize agreements, and establish communal norms. Legal codification during this period was informed both by Gaelic custom and residual Pictish practice, producing a hybrid system that balanced local autonomy with centralized oversight. These frameworks provided continuity and predictability, allowing Alba to absorb new territories while maintaining social stability. Territorial expansion was complemented by ecclesiastical integration. Monastic centers and bishoprics played roles not only in religious life, but also in legitimizing kingship and mediating disputes. Monks and clerics maintained records of land grants, genealogies, and tribute, reinforcing the connection between spiritual authority and secular governance. Christianity provided ideological cohesion, encouraging loyalty to the crown and supporting emerging notions of a unified Scottish polity. The Church also facilitated cultural transmission, preserving literacy and administrative knowledge that enabled more effective management of expanding territories. By the 11th century, Alba had established a pattern of regional governance layered with royal oversight, kinship networks, and ecclesiastical support. The combined pressures of external Viking raids and internal consolidation fostered a resilient political structure capable of maintaining authority across diverse landscapes. Fortified sites, administrative centers, and networked assemblies allowed kings to exercise influence without dismantling local traditions, creating a balance between central control and regional autonomy. This era of governance laid the foundation for legal, military, and fiscal institutions that would endure into later medieval Scotland. The integration of law, landholding, and territorial oversight illustrates how Alba transformed from a nascent kingdom into a cohesive polity. By linking kinship obligations, tribute, and defense under centralized authority, Scottish kings strengthened internal cohesion in response to external pressures. The development of these systems provided both stability and adaptability, ensuring that the kingdom could endure the challenges of the Viking Age and beyond. With secure governance and social order in place, Alba was prepared to support cultural, artistic, and religious flourishing, setting the stage for the emergence of a distinctly Scottish identity. By the 10th and 11th centuries, the cultural landscape of Alba was increasingly shaped by the dominance of Gaelic language and customs, which influenced legal practice, poetic expression, and the rituals surrounding kingship. Gaelic became the language of administration and courtly life, used to record genealogies, compose praise poetry, and articulate law codes. Bards and poets played central roles in reinforcing the authority of kings, commemorating victories, and preserving historical memory, ensuring that cultural expression both reflected and reinforced political power. Legal terminology, ceremonial practice, and social hierarchy were embedded in this Gaelic framework, creating a coherent cultural and political identity across diverse regions of the kingdom. At the same time, Alba's population was not culturally homogeneous. Norse settlers along the western seaboard and in the Northern Isles introduced language, trade practices, and maritime expertise that influenced local communities. Archaeological and place name evidence indicates Norse integration into coastal settlements, contributing both material culture and linguistic elements that persisted in toponyms and dialects. In the south and southwest, Brittonic elements from the former kingdoms of Strathclyde were gradually absorbed into Gaelic-dominated political structures. This blending of cultures facilitated the emergence of a Scottish identity that was increasingly territorial rather than purely tribal, linking allegiance to the Kingdom of Alba rather than to narrower kinship networks. Territorial identity was reinforced by patterns of settlement, administration, and communication. Royal centers, ecclesiastical institutions, and fortified sites created focal points for authority and culture, encouraging loyalty to the crown over local factions. Monastic networks and parish churches further strengthened this sense of cohesion, transmitting literacy, religious observance, and administrative knowledge across the kingdom. Through these channels, communities internalized a shared set of practices, beliefs, and symbolic markers that distinguished Alba from neighboring polities, including Norse-held territories and Brittonic enclaves. The synthesis of Gaelic, Norse, and Brittonic elements illustrates how early Scottish identity was constructed through both adaptation and selective integration. Cultural exchange, intermarriage, and political negotiation allowed regional diversity to coexist with the assertion of central authority. Language, law, and ritual provided a medium through which kings could project power and unify disparate communities under a shared sense of belonging. This process demonstrates that identity in early Scotland was dynamic, emerging from practical governance needs, social cohesion, and cultural continuity rather than from external imposition. By the end of the 11th century, Alba had developed a confident territorial identity that would form the foundation for the medieval Scottish kingdom. Gaelic culture remained predominant, yet its fusion with Norse and Brittonic influences produced a distinctive Scottish ethos that extended beyond tribal affiliation. Political and cultural cohesion reinforced the authority of kings, facilitated administration, and provided a sense of collective belonging across the kingdom. This evolving identity was central to the legitimacy of royal power and prepared Alba for the transformations that feudalization, Norman influence, and later external pressures would bring. The consolidation of language, law, and cultural practice demonstrates that the emergence of Scots as a people was a gradual process rooted in territorial loyalty and shared cultural norms. By integrating diverse influences while maintaining Gaelic frameworks, Alba created a durable social and political identity. This cohesion and self-awareness enabled the kingdom to navigate the challenges of feudal transformation, external threats, and internal consolidation, ensuring that Scotland could evolve into a complex, territorially defined polity capable of enduring in the medieval period. King David I, who reigned from 1124 to 1153, is widely recognized as a transformative figure in the development of medieval Scotland. Educated at the Anglo-Norman court in England, he returned to his native kingdom equipped with both knowledge of continental governance and connections to European nobility. David's reign introduced feudal structures that fundamentally reshaped Scotland's political, legal, and economic landscape. Central to this transformation was the distribution of land to Norman, Flemish, and other foreign nobles in exchange for military service and loyalty. These grants replaced older kin-based systems of landholding with a territorial hierarchy organized around loyalty to the crown. By aligning Scottish governance with contemporary European norms, David established both a stronger monarchy and a network of landed elites capable of supporting royal authority. The introduction of feudal lordship brought significant architectural and military innovations. Castles, initially constructed of timber and later in stone, emerged across strategic locations, serving as instruments of control and visible symbols of authority. Archaeological evidence from early motte and bailey structures, such as those at Roxburgh and Edinburgh, demonstrates their role in asserting royal dominance over newly integrated territories. These fortifications not only offered defense against rival magnates and rebellious clans, but also acted as administrative centers, where sheriffs and other royal officials could exercise oversight. The spread of castles reflects the practical implementation of feudal obligations, consolidating military, legal, and economic control in a single locus. David also formalized royal administration through the introduction of sheriffs, who oversaw local justice, tax collection, and the enforcement of royal directives. Written charters became increasingly common, recording land grants, privileges, and obligations in a manner consistent with European legal traditions. These documents facilitated accountability and standardized interactions between the crown and its vassals, enabling the monarchy to exert influence over increasingly distant regions. Monastic charters, in particular, provide detailed records of land transactions and legal privileges, illustrating how David's reforms intersected with ecclesiastical authority to reinforce both spiritual and secular governance. The king's policies did not entirely displace existing Gaelic structures. Rather, feudalism was layered upon older social systems, creating a hybrid model in which traditional kinship obligations coexisted with territorial lordship. Archaeological evidence from burghs, monasteries, and rural estates shows continuity in settlement patterns alongside the introduction of new administrative practices. This hybridization allowed Scotland to modernize politically and economically without provoking widespread social upheaval. Communities adapted to the presence of foreign nobles, incorporating new legal and fiscal expectations while retaining local customs, producing a uniquely Scottish form of feudal governance. Economically, the reign of David I stimulated the development of burghs and trade centers, which supported both royal authority and the obligations of feudal lords. Burghs were chartered towns that facilitated commerce, market regulation, and taxation, linking rural estates to regional and international trade networks. Archaeological excavations in burghs such as Stirling and Perth reveal evidence of planned street layouts, workshops, and marketplaces, demonstrating how these urban centers became engines of economic growth. By fostering trade and consolidating resources, David ensured that feudal obligations could be met and that royal authority was supported by a stable economic base. Through these combined initiatives, land redistribution, castle construction, administrative reform, and urban development, David I established a durable framework for medieval Scottish statehood. His reforms provided mechanisms for enforcing loyalty, regulating justice, and supporting military service, while integrating Scotland into broader European cultural and political norms. The legacy of David's reign illustrates that transformative governance can occur through strategic adaptation and layering of institutions rather than wholesale replacement of existing structures. David's introduction of feudal systems, castles, and written administration fundamentally reshaped Scotland, creating a monarchy capable of asserting authority across diverse territories. By combining European models with native traditions, he established a hybrid system that balanced innovation with continuity. These reforms strengthened royal power, structured societal obligations, and laid the groundwork for economic and cultural development. The creation of administrative and military infrastructure under David I provided the foundation upon which subsequent kings would build, linking political authority with economic and social stability, and setting the stage for the rise of towns, commerce, and further consolidation of the Scottish kingdom. Between the 12th and 13th centuries, Scotland underwent significant economic transformation, largely driven by the creation and expansion of royal burghs. These chartered towns, initiated under King David I and continued by his successors, became centers of trade, taxation, and royal authority, linking rural estates to broader regional and international networks. Burghs such as Edinburgh, Perth, Stirling, and Aberdeen were strategically located on rivers, coasts, or crossroads, facilitating access to both domestic and foreign markets. Charters granted by the Crown provided merchants with legal privileges, including protection of property, freedom from certain tolls, and the right to self-governance within the town. These incentives attracted settlers from England, Flanders, Scandinavia, and other parts of Europe, introducing new skills, commercial practices, and cultural influences into Scottish society. Archaeological evidence from burghs illustrates both the material and organizational complexity of these towns. Excavations reveal structured street plans, fortified boundaries, warehouses, workshops, and harbor installations, indicating deliberate urban planning and investment in infrastructure. Coins, imported pottery, and weights recovered from sites demonstrate participation in extensive trade networks, particularly across the North Sea. Scottish exports included wool, hides, fish, and other raw materials, while imported goods ranged from luxury textiles to metalwork and ceramics. The integration of Scotland into these maritime and overland trading systems enhanced economic prosperity and facilitated cultural exchange, connecting Scottish merchants and townspeople to continental Europe. The development of burghs also transformed the social structure of medieval Scotland. While the majority of the population remained rural, dependent on subsistence agriculture, towns fostered a growing merchant class that operated alongside traditional landholding elites and the clergy. Merchants and artisans accumulated wealth through trade, craft specialization, and commercial networks, creating new forms of influence independent of feudal land tenure. Guilds and other organized associations emerged, regulating professional practice, maintaining quality, and protecting economic interests. These urban institutions allowed towns to exercise a degree of autonomy while reinforcing loyalty to the crown through taxation and market regulation. Burghs strengthened royal authority by providing a stable source of revenue and reducing dependence on purely military power. Market tolls, rents, and customs collected within burghs contributed directly to the crown's coffers, supporting administration, defense, and infrastructure projects. By establishing legal frameworks for commerce and governance, the monarchy ensured that economic activity reinforced political authority. Burgh charters also allowed the crown to project influence into newly settled or contested territories, consolidating control over both land and population. This combination of economic incentives and legal structures exemplifies how state formation in medieval Scotland relied on institutional development as much as on military conquest. Integration into North Sea and continental trade networks made Scotland increasingly interdependent with neighboring regions, including England, Flanders, and Scandinavia. These commercial links not only brought wealth, but also exposed the kingdom to foreign legal practices, financial instruments, and cultural trends. Such economic interdependence would later shape political dynamics, as Scottish kings navigated the complex interplay of trade, diplomacy, and territorial sovereignty. The prosperity of burghs created both opportunities and obligations, tying local and national interests to broader European markets. The rise of burghs and the development of a monetized economy exemplify how small trading towns could quietly shift the balance of power in medieval Scotland. By attracting settlers, regulating commerce, and generating revenue, these urban centers reinforced royal authority, diversified society, and integrated Scotland into continental economic networks. Economic innovation complemented feudal structures, ensuring that the crown could support administration and defense without relying solely on military coercion. The growth of towns laid the groundwork for social mobility, institutional complexity, and cultural exchange, and it prepared the kingdom for the increasing influence of the church, whose power would expand alongside these emerging urban centers. From the 12th century onward, ecclesiastical reform fundamentally reshaped Scottish society, intertwining spiritual authority with political and cultural transformation. During this period, the Scottish Church increasingly aligned with Roman Catholic norms, transitioning from informal, monastic-centered networks to structured diocesan systems under episcopal oversight. This alignment standardized liturgical practice, codified canon law, and strengthened hierarchical organization, enabling the Church to function as a stabilizing institution across a politically fragmented landscape. The introduction of new religious orders, including Benedictines, Cistercians, and Augustinians, further enhanced this institutional framework. Abbeys such as Melrose, Holyrood, and Dunfermline became centers not only of spiritual devotion, but also of agricultural innovation, literacy, and administrative record-keeping, integrating the church into both the economic and intellectual life of the kingdom. Religious reform reinforced royal authority by providing ideological and practical support for kingship. Monastic institutions documented land grants, charters, and genealogies, legitimizing claims to territory and consolidating legal authority. Bishops and abbots often acted as royal advisors or administrators, bridging secular and ecclesiastical responsibilities. By associating the crown with spiritual oversight, the Church lent moral legitimacy to royal policies, strengthened central governance, and mediated disputes between magnates. Latin literacy, cultivated within monastic schools and scriptoria, enabled the production of legal codes, chronicles, and correspondence with continental authorities. This expanded Scotland's participation in European intellectual life, connecting the kingdom to networks of scholarship and diplomacy while allowing vernacular traditions to coexist alongside written Latin records. The economic impact of ecclesiastical reform was equally significant. Monastic estates introduced systematic agricultural practices, such as crop rotation, drainage, and animal husbandry, increasing productivity and generating surpluses that supported both monastic communities and the crown. Monasteries operated granges and workshops, producing tools, textiles, and foodstuffs for local markets. These economic activities reinforced the social influence of the church while complementing the development of burghs and the monetized economy established under David I and his successors. The integration of spiritual, economic, and administrative functions created a multifaceted institution capable of shaping both everyday life and long-term national development. Importantly, Scotland's church maintained independence from English ecclesiastical control, reinforcing national sovereignty during a period of close geographical and political interaction with England. Papal recognition of Scottish dioceses and abbeys affirmed the kingdom's ecclesiastical autonomy, allowing Scottish kings to cultivate loyalty from clerics without external interference. This autonomy strengthened political cohesion and enabled the crown to leverage religious authority in matters of succession, territorial dispute, and diplomacy. By combining spiritual leadership with institutional independence, the church became a central pillar of both cultural identity and political stability. The cultural influence of ecclesiastical reform extended into literacy, learning, and artistic production. Manuscript illumination, metalwork, and stone carving flourished under monastic patronage, reflecting both European styles and local Scottish traditions. Scriptoria preserved historical records and chronicles, ensuring continuity of memory and reinforcing collective identity. Education within monastic schools produced administrators capable of managing burghs, collecting tribute, and overseeing judicial processes, linking literacy directly to the functioning of the medieval state. Through these mechanisms, the church facilitated cultural cohesion, standardized governance, and promoted a shared sense of Scottish identity across diverse regions. By the end of the 12th century, Scotland had emerged as a more centralized, economically active, and spiritually unified kingdom. Church reform had reinforced royal authority, created networks of literacy and administration, and anchored cultural identity, all while preserving political independence from neighboring powers. Monastic and diocesan institutions intertwined with urban growth, trade, and feudal structures, producing a durable framework for governance and cultural continuity. This combination of economic, spiritual, and political integration provided the Scottish kingdom with the resilience to confront external pressures, defend its territories, and maintain sovereignty, establishing the conditions for the continuation of a distinctly Scottish state in the medieval period. The origins of the Wars of Scottish Independence can be traced directly to a succession crisis that followed the deaths of King Alexander III in 1286 and his granddaughter and heir, Margaret of Norway, in 1290. Alexander's unexpected demise left Scotland without a direct adult monarch, creating a power vacuum in a kingdom whose governance relied heavily on strong centralized authority. Leading Scottish nobles faced competing claims from multiple aristocratic families, most prominently John Balliol and Robert Bruce, the elder. Concerned that internal conflict could lead to civil war, they sought an external arbitrator to legitimize succession and prevent internecine strife. Edward I of England, a powerful neighboring monarch with long-standing ambitions in the British Isles, was invited to mediate, setting the stage for an extraordinary intersection of law, diplomacy, and ambition. Edward I approached the arbitration with a calculated strategy, asserting his feudal overlordship over Scotland as a condition for his judgment. In 1292, he declared John Balliol the rightful king, a decision that effectively subordinated Scotland to English authority. Legal documents from the period, including the arbitration proceedings and Balliol's subsequent oaths of fealty, illustrate the formal mechanisms Edward employed to justify political domination. Rather than resolving the succession dispute impartially, Edward leveraged his position to impose a hierarchical relationship that reduced Scotland's autonomy. By intertwining legal authority with political pressure, he transformed a domestic constitutional crisis into an instrument of conquest. Balliol's reign was immediately constrained by Edward's demands. As the Scottish king attempted to assert independent governance, Edward enforced compliance through a combination of diplomatic coercion and military threat. Administrative records show that Edward's envoys monitored Scottish councils, demanded military support for campaigns abroad, and required approval for key decisions, effectively undermining Balliol's sovereignty. The king's resistance culminated in Edward's military intervention in 1296, when English forces invaded, sacked the border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed, and captured strategic strongholds across southern Scotland. The Stone of Destiny, a symbolic emblem of Scottish kingship, was removed to Westminster, signaling both a physical and psychological assertion of English dominance over the kingdom. Contemporary chronicles depict the arbitration as a turning point in which law and diplomacy became tools of subjugation. Rather than a popular uprising or external invasion prompted by long-standing animosity, the conflict originated from a legal process that escalated into open warfare. Edward's ability to manipulate feudal law, combined with the compliance or miscalculation of Scottish nobles, highlights how institutional mechanisms could be exploited to undermine sovereignty. The use of legal arbitration to assert overlordship demonstrates the interplay between medieval legal frameworks and political ambition, revealing that constitutional crises could have consequences as devastating as battlefield defeats. The succession crisis and Edward's intervention fundamentally altered Scotland's political trajectory. By subordinating the monarchy and imposing foreign oversight, England destabilized the traditional balance of power between the crown and the nobility, creating widespread resentment. The loss of royal authority fractured the Scottish elite and exposed the kingdom to military occupation, taxation, and administrative control by an external power. These conditions planted the seeds for a broader resistance movement, extending beyond the courtly and aristocratic circles that initially managed succession disputes. The events of 1286 to 1296 illustrate how a domestic legal problem evolved into an international crisis with lasting consequences. Scotland's vulnerability following Alexander III's death provided Edward I the opportunity to convert arbitration into domination, demonstrating the fragility of medieval sovereignty in the face of legal manipulation and military intimidation. This collapse of centralized authority created the environment in which resistance could emerge, as nobles, clergy, and eventually commoners sought to defend national autonomy. The constitutional crisis transformed into conquest, setting the stage for a protracted struggle that would define Scottish identity and political survival in the late 13th and early 14th centuries. In the wake of English occupation following Edward I's invasion, popular resistance in Scotland quickly emerged, fueled by resentment toward foreign domination and the erosion of traditional authority. Central to this movement were figures such as William Wallace and Andrew de Moray, whose leadership transformed localized uprisings into coordinated military campaigns. Contemporary chronicles, including the Late Antiquity Chronicle, provide evidence of these early rebellions, while later accounts and literary works have contributed to a legendary narrative surrounding Wallace. Modern historical analysis distinguishes between these sources, emphasizing the practical organization, strategy, and social dynamics that underpin the resistance rather than relying solely on heroic myth. Wallace's rise illustrates how local leaders could harness popular support and exploit knowledge of the terrain to challenge a numerically superior force. In 1297, Wallace and de Moray achieved a notable victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, where careful positioning along a narrow river crossing allowed the Scottish forces to neutralize the advantages of the English army. Tactical use of geography, combined with disciplined archery and infantry coordination, compensated for the lack of heavy cavalry and professional soldiers. This victory disrupted English control, encouraged further uprisings, and demonstrated that organized resistance was feasible even against a well-equipped occupying force. However, subsequent engagements highlighted the limits of irregular warfare. At the Battle of Falkirk in 1298, Wallace's forces were decisively defeated by Edward I's army, which employed combined infantry, cavalry, and archery in coordinated maneuvers. The defeat exposed the challenges of sustaining prolonged military campaigns without a standing army or centralized supply networks. Despite these setbacks, Wallace continued to conduct raids, negotiate alliances, and maintain resistance in the Scottish lowlands, demonstrating that insurgent campaigns could persist through decentralized leadership and collective action rather than relying solely on formal command structures. Wallace's eventual capture in 1305 and his execution in London symbolized Edward I's determination to suppress rebellion and reinforce English authority. Nevertheless, the campaigns of Wallace and de Moray had a lasting impact beyond their immediate military outcomes. They transformed resistance into a national cause, uniting disparate communities against a common occupier and legitimizing the broader struggle for sovereignty. Participation in these campaigns was widespread, drawing from rural populations, local militias, and sympathetic nobles, highlighting that the war effort depended on collective mobilization rather than the actions of a single individual. The persistence of resistance despite repeated defeats reflects the interplay of social grievance, local leadership, and territorial familiarity. Communities disrupted by occupation, taxation, and military requisition found incentive to support insurgent forces, while leaders such as Wallace coordinated efforts across regional networks. This dynamic created an enduring framework for rebellion, capable of adapting to changing circumstances and maintaining momentum even in the absence of conventional political authority. By demonstrating that English control could be challenged and that victories, even temporary ones, were possible, the campaigns of Wallace and de Moray set a precedent for sustained military resistance. The popular nature of the uprising laid the groundwork for subsequent leadership to assume command with greater political legitimacy and resources. The mobilization of ordinary Scots into a coordinated military effort established the principle that sovereignty and independence could be defended collectively, shaping the trajectory of the Wars of Scottish Independence in the years that followed. Robert the Bruce's ascent from noble contender to King of Scots exemplifies the complex interplay of ambition, strategy, and political consolidation during the Wars of Scottish Independence. In 1306, following the killing of his rival John Comyn at Greyfriars Church in Dumfries, Bruce asserted his claim to the throne and was crowned at Scone, invoking the traditional ritual that linked kingship to sacred authority and continuity. His initial campaigns were marked by severe setbacks, as English forces occupied key fortresses and rival Scottish factions remained divided, leaving Bruce's early kingship precarious. Contemporary chronicles describe a period of near collapse, in which survival required both military ingenuity and the careful cultivation of alliances among hesitant nobles. Edward I's death in 1307 significantly shifted the strategic landscape, offering Bruce an opportunity to consolidate his position. He adopted a strategy of guerrilla warfare, targeting English garrisons, supply lines, and isolated strongholds while avoiding direct confrontation with numerically superior forces. Archaeological surveys reveal widespread destruction of castles and fortifications in occupied territories, indicative of deliberate, slighting campaigns designed to deny the English any secure foothold. This approach disrupted the occupying administration, reduced the effectiveness of enemy forces, and allowed Bruce's forces to strike selectively, gradually reclaiming territory without overextending their limited resources. Political consolidation was as critical as military strategy. Bruce worked to secure the loyalty of Scottish nobles, including those who had initially opposed him, through a combination of negotiation, strategic marriage alliances, and redistribution of lands confiscated from rival families. This redistribution reinforced fealty to the crown while simultaneously stabilizing regional governance. By blending reward with reconciliation, Bruce strengthened the monarchy's authority and mitigated internal divisions that had previously weakened Scotland's resistance. Monastic records and charters from the period document these land transfers, illustrating how Bruce used formalized administrative tools to complement his military campaigns. Bruce's kingship also emphasized the integration of symbolic and practical authority. Crowning rituals at Scone and the public assertion of sovereignty reinforced his legitimacy in the eyes of both the nobility and common people. Monastic chroniclers and later historians emphasized his role as a unifying figure, yet evidence suggests that his long-term success relied on pragmatic adaptability, maintaining mobility, exploiting local knowledge, and cultivating networks of loyal supporters across both highland and lowland regions. By balancing military initiative with political accommodation, Bruce rebuilt royal authority in a fragmented kingdom, creating an operational framework for governance and defense. By the early 1310s, Bruce's combined military and political strategy had restored significant portions of Scottish territory under royal control. His approach highlights the importance of sustained strategic planning, rather than singular battlefield victories, in re-establishing a collapsed monarchy. The deliberate targeting of English strongholds, reconciliation with nobles, and the assertion of symbolic legitimacy created a stable foundation for subsequent campaigns aimed at securing full independence. Bruce's example demonstrates that recovery from near-total defeat required not only courage and tactical skill, but also long-term vision, institutional rebuilding, and the ability to unify a divided polity around a common purpose. Robert the Bruce's early kingship set the stage for the decisive confrontations that would define Scottish sovereignty. By combining adaptive military tactics with political reconciliation and administrative rebuilding, he transformed a vulnerable claimant into a legitimate and effective monarch. This period illustrates that leadership in the context of near collapse depends on strategic foresight, the cultivation of alliances, and the integration of symbolic and practical authority, a framework that would ultimately enable Scotland to regain independence and consolidate its medieval kingdom. The decisive turning point in the Wars of Scottish Independence occurred at the Battle of Bannockburn in June 1314, where Robert the Bruce secured a resounding victory over the forces of Edward II. Bruce's army, though smaller in number, effectively utilized terrain, disciplined infantry formations, and tactical innovation to neutralize English advantages in cavalry and archery. The triumph at Bannockburn not only demonstrated Scottish military capability, but also strengthened Bruce's authority domestically, rallying nobles and commoners alike around the crown. Archaeological surveys and contemporary chronicles highlight the strategic importance of the Bannockburn landscape, where marshes, ridges, and river crossings were exploited to devastating effect. Despite this battlefield success, independence was not immediately assured. English resistance continued through northern garrisons, sporadic raids, and attempts to destabilize Bruce's rule via proxy factions. To secure lasting sovereignty, Scotland pursued coordinated military campaigns, including cross-border raids and alliances with Irish chieftains, designed to pressure England into negotiation. These operations underscored that military victories, while necessary, were insufficient to guarantee international recognition of statehood or the legitimacy of the monarchy. The protracted nature of conflict emphasized the interplay between armed resistance and political strategy in achieving durable independence. Diplomatic efforts were equally critical to consolidating Scotland's position. In 1320, Scottish leaders issued the Declaration of Arbroath, a letter to Pope John XXII, articulating a theory of sovereignty based on the collective authority of the realm rather than the prerogatives of a single ruler. The declaration asserted that the king's legitimacy derived from his responsibility to the people and the kingdom, establishing a framework for governance that balanced monarchical power with national accountability. Papal correspondence, coupled with envoys dispatched to European courts, illustrates the importance of international diplomacy in legitimizing Scotland's claim to independence. Recognition from the papacy and other European powers was essential to ensuring that English claims could not be imposed unilaterally. Negotiation culminated in the Treaty of Edinburgh, Northampton in 1328, formally acknowledging Robert I as king and Scotland as an independent realm. This treaty represented a synthesis of military achievement and diplomatic negotiation, demonstrating that sovereignty in the medieval context required both force and legitimacy. Contemporary accounts describe the treaty as the culmination of decades of struggle, wherein battlefield success, strategic alliances, and political argumentation converged to secure recognition. The combination of legal articulation, international advocacy, and sustained resistance created a durable framework for Scottish autonomy. Bannockburn and the subsequent diplomatic efforts highlight that independence was not solely the product of military victory, but a multidimensional process integrating strategy, negotiation, and institutional legitimacy. The Scottish Crown's ability to leverage battlefield triumph and to recognize sovereignty exemplifies the complexity of state formation in the medieval period. By coupling effective military leadership with sustained diplomatic engagement, Robert the Bruce and his advisors ensured that Scotland emerged from prolonged conflict as a recognized, self-governing kingdom. With formal independence achieved, Scotland transitioned from a period defined by external threat to one focused on internal stability, governance, and consolidation. The combination of military, political, and diplomatic accomplishments during this period laid the foundations for a resilient medieval kingdom capable of navigating both domestic challenges and continental relations. In the decades following the Wars of Scottish Independence, the legacy of Robert the Bruce shaped both the opportunities and vulnerabilities of the Scottish kingdom. Although his military and diplomatic achievements secured formal independence from England, Bruce's death in 1329 left the throne to his young son, David II, aged only 5. The minority of a monarch inherently weakened centralized authority, requiring regents to manage governance while navigating ongoing threats from internal and external rivals. During this period, Scotland faced renewed challenges from Edward Balliol, backed by English forces and the faction known as the Disinherited Nobles, who sought to reclaim lands and titles lost during Bruce's campaigns. These incursions exposed the fragility of royal authority in a kingdom still consolidating after decades of conflict. Military engagements during David II's minority, such as the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, underscored the ongoing vulnerability of Scotland. English forces, employing superior numbers and tactical coordination, decisively defeated the Scots, capturing key nobility and weakening regional defense structures. Contemporary chronicles and financial records illustrate the strain these conflicts placed on the crown, as regents attempted to maintain territorial integrity and fund defense through taxation, loans, and negotiation with powerful noble families. The reliance on regency governance further complicated authority, as rival factions within the nobility pursued their own agendas, exploiting periods of royal weakness to assert regional influence. David II's later reign was similarly marked by instability. Following his capture at the Battle of Neville's Cross in 1346, he remained in English captivity for over a decade, during which Scotland's governance was again in the hands of regents. Fiscal obligations imposed by his ransom, recorded in parliamentary accounts, placed enormous pressure on royal finances and intensified noble bargaining over taxation, military service, and land tenure. The need to fund the king's ransom forced concessions that undermined the central authority of the monarchy, demonstrating that sovereignty achieved on the battlefield did not automatically translate into administrative or fiscal stability. Despite these challenges, the survival of the Bruce line reinforced the principle of hereditary kingship and the legitimacy of the Scottish crown. Monastic and governmental records emphasize continuity of the royal line as a stabilizing symbol, even when practical authority was constrained. The Bruce dynasty embodied the notion of national sovereignty and provided a focal point around which both elite and common populations could rally. This symbolic authority was crucial in maintaining cohesion and asserting Scottish identity, particularly in the face of English attempts to exploit political vulnerability. The period following Robert I's death demonstrates that the victories of the Wars of Independence did not produce immediate internal stability. Scotland remained a kingdom with fragile institutions, dependent on regency leadership, loyal nobility, and military resilience. Parliamentary and fiscal records from the era reveal ongoing negotiation between crown and nobles, illustrating the balance of power required to sustain authority and governance. The combination of foreign threat, regency rule, and fiscal pressure highlighted the structural weaknesses of medieval Scottish statehood, emphasizing that political consolidation was a gradual and contested process. The fragility of royal authority during David II's minority and captivity created space for regional elites to expand their influence, setting the stage for a more decentralized and clan-based political landscape. While the Bruce legacy provided symbolic continuity and legitimacy, the practical realities of governing a post-war kingdom underscored the persistent challenges of maintaining centralized authority in a fractious and militarized society. This environment would shape the evolving dynamics between crown, nobility, and emerging clan structures in late medieval Scotland. In the 14th and 15th centuries, Scotland's political landscape was characterized by a duality between lowland feudalism and highland clan-based lordship. While the lowlands increasingly adopted continental-style feudal structures, including hierarchical landholding, burgh administration, and codified law, the highlands and western regions maintained social and political organization rooted in kinship networks, customary law, and personal allegiance. Clans such as the MacDonalds, Campbells, and MacLeods emerged as dominant regional powers, exercising authority over extensive territories often equivalent to or exceeding those of feudal barons in the south. These clans combined military capability, local governance, and economic control, shaping society through both formal agreements and customary practice. The Lordship of the Isles exemplifies the semi-independent political systems that developed in the West. Controlled predominantly by the MacDonald clan, the lordship integrated Norse Gaelic cultural influences, maritime expertise, and extensive trade networks along the Hebrides and western seaboard. The lordship exercised considerable autonomy, maintaining its own courts, collecting tribute, and conducting foreign diplomacy, particularly with Ireland and other North Atlantic polities. Its naval power allowed rapid troop movement, enforcement of authority, and protection of trade, demonstrating that regional autonomy was supported not only by kinship loyalty, but also by strategic geography and economic strength. Royal attempts to assert control over the Highlands and Isles were uneven and often relied on a combination of alliances, legal instruments, and intermittent military campaigns. Charters, land grants, and legal records indicate that the crown negotiated with clan leaders through marriage alliances, confirmations of title, and recognition of local rights, aiming to co-opt loyalty rather than impose direct authority. In cases of rebellion or defiance, forfeitures and punitive expeditions were undertaken, though enforcement was limited by the region's rugged terrain and the clan's capacity for mobilization. This delicate balance illustrates that Highland political systems were not primitive but adaptive, structured to maintain cohesion and authority in challenging landscapes. Clan identity and loyalty were central to governance and social stability. Allegiance often owed more to the head of a clan than to the distant monarch, reflecting practical realities of communication, military protection, and economic management. Disputes within and between clans were resolved through customary law, mediated councils, or military action, reinforcing the authority of chiefs and the cohesion of kin-based networks. The clan system facilitated local administration, resource allocation, and defense, demonstrating its functional equivalence to feudal lordship, even if it diverged from lowland norms. Economic factors reinforced clan power. Control over arable land, pastoral resources, fisheries, and trade routes enabled clans to sustain military forces, patronize artisans, and negotiate alliances. The integration of maritime trade in the Lordship of the Isles connected regional economies to broader North Atlantic networks, further consolidating political autonomy. Charters and legal disputes reflect ongoing negotiation between the crown and clans, revealing a complex interplay of authority, obligation, and negotiation rather than simple opposition. Understanding the structure and adaptability of clan-based lordship highlights why loyalty to the clan often outweighed allegiance to the crown. In regions where geographic isolation and local custom prevailed, the crown's ability to project authority was limited, making clan leadership the primary mechanism for governance, defense, and social organization. These competing power centers not only influenced local politics, but also shaped court culture, diplomacy, and broader governance, as monarchs had to accommodate or co-opt regional leaders to maintain national cohesion. The resilience and adaptability of clan structures set the stage for ongoing interactions between central authority and regional power, creating a dynamic medieval kingdom in which the crown negotiated its authority with influential local actors. This environment would profoundly influence political strategy, conflict management, and social hierarchy in Scotland for centuries to come. The accession of the Stuart dynasty in 1371, with Robert II ascending to the Scottish throne, marked a new chapter in the consolidation of royal authority. The Stuarts sought to strengthen the monarchy through strategic patronage, legal reform, and the cultivation of courtly culture, aiming to balance the competing interests of powerful noble families while asserting central control. Their approach combined symbolic authority with practical governance, leveraging ceremonial kingship, land grants, and judicial oversight to reinforce the crown's legitimacy. Architectural projects, such as expansions at Stirling Castle, reflected both defensive needs and an emerging taste for Renaissance-inspired courtly aesthetics, signaling a monarchy attentive to both power and prestige. Despite these efforts, the Stuart kings faced persistent challenges from the nobility, whose regional power could rival or exceed that of the crown. The reign of James I, following his return from English captivity in 1424, illustrates the delicate balance required to assert authority. James pursued a program of legal reform, judicial centralization, and suppression of overmighty nobles who threatened royal prerogative. He established courts of law to regulate disputes, implemented more consistent fiscal oversight, and executed or neutralized rebellious lords, demonstrating both the possibilities and limits of centralized governance. His assassination in 1437 underscored the inherent dangers of confronting entrenched aristocratic interests, revealing the risks involved in the assertion of royal ambition. Subsequent Stuart monarchs adopted more measured approaches, balancing authority through alliances, dynastic marriages, and ceremonial displays of power. Royal courts became centers of diplomacy, culture, and administrative coordination, mediating relations between the crown, nobility, and clergy. Patronage of artists, scholars, and architects fostered cultural growth, while the introduction of chanceries and record-keeping expanded the reach of royal administration. Architectural and material evidence, including fortified palaces and embellished castles, demonstrates the integration of practical defense with symbolic representation of power. Literacy and the production of manuscripts increased under royal sponsorship, reflecting an expanding intellectual culture connected to broader European trends. The Stuart kings also actively engaged in international diplomacy, negotiating alliances, marriages, and treaties with France, England, and other European states. These engagements reinforced Scotland's position on the continental stage and provided leverage in internal politics, as foreign recognition enhanced domestic legitimacy. Court records from the period indicate a sophisticated network of correspondence, legal documentation, and ceremonial protocols designed to project authority, cultivate loyalty, and regulate governance across diverse regions of the kingdom. This period highlights the dual nature of royal ambition. It could consolidate authority, advance cultural and administrative development, and enhance international standing, yet it also provoked resistance, and created vulnerabilities. The Crown's efforts to centralize power required negotiation, coercion, and adaptation, revealing that authority in late medieval Scotland was contingent, relational, and often contested. Literacy, artistic patronage, and architectural investment became tools of both governance and symbolism, reinforcing the Crown's position while reflecting broader European influence. As royal authority expanded under the Stuarts, unresolved tensions between crown, nobility, and church persisted, laying the groundwork for future political and religious upheavals. The mechanisms of courtly culture, legal reform, and patronage established during this period created both stability and friction, preparing the Scottish kingdom for the transformations of the Reformation and the union of crowns that would emerge in the following century. By the late 15th and early 16th centuries, the Scottish Church occupied a central position in both the spiritual and temporal life of the kingdom. It was among the largest landholders, controlling estates, collecting rents, and exercising judicial authority over clerical and lay populations alike. Bishoprics, monasteries, and collegiate churches not only guided religious practice, but also managed education, welfare, and charitable functions, becoming integral to the kingdom's administrative and social infrastructure. Monastic schools and universities, St. Andrews, Glasgow, and Aberdeen, produced literate clerics and administrators, extending the church's influence into legal, fiscal, and intellectual spheres. Yet despite its institutional strength, the church faced increasing criticism from multiple quarters, exposing structural and ideological vulnerabilities. One major source of tension was clerical pluralism and absenteeism. Many bishops and abbots held multiple benefices simultaneously, often residing elsewhere while drawing income from distant parishes. This practice, combined with the sale of ecclesiastical offices, eroded local pastoral care and undermined confidence in the clergy. Ordinary Scots, accustomed to practical engagement with parish priests, increasingly viewed senior ecclesiastical figures as distant and self-interested. Complaints recorded in council records and local petitions demonstrate that these practices fueled resentment, creating fertile ground for reformist thought to take hold. Intellectual currents further encouraged critique. Humanist scholarship, introduced through Scottish universities and contact with continental Europe, emphasized textual analysis, critical reading of scripture, and the value of education in both moral and civic life. Figures such as James V's court scholars and university lecturers propagated ideas that questioned clerical excess and encouraged individual engagement with religious texts. This scholarly movement, although initially limited to elite circles, gradually permeated broader networks through correspondence, book circulation, and the movement of students and clerics between towns and monasteries. Early expressions of heresy revealed the penetration of reformist thought into Scottish society. The trial and execution of Patrick Hamilton in 1528, often described as the first Scottish Protestant martyr, demonstrated both the presence of Lutheran ideas and the Church's initial response to doctrinal challenge. Hamilton's writings, influenced by continental reformers, circulated through universities and urban centers, illustrating the intersection of trade, education, and religious discourse in spreading reformist thought. The case exemplified how ideas could move independently of direct institutional oversight, undermining the Church's ability to enforce orthodoxy through traditional mechanisms. Economic and political structures also contributed to openness toward reform. Wealth accumulation by the Church, combined with absentee management and the Crown's reliance on clerical revenues, created both resentment and dependency. Nobles, merchants, and civic leaders increasingly questioned the legitimacy of clerical privilege, seeing reformist critique as compatible with their own interests. Local conflicts over tithes, lands, and legal authority often aligned secular and religious critiques, amplifying the momentum for change. These factors demonstrate that pressure for reform in Scotland arose organically as much as it was influenced by continental Europe. Intellectual engagement, social grievances, clerical malpractice, and early Lutheran ideas combined to weaken public confidence in the Church. By the early 16th century, Scotland had developed an environment in which reformist thought could spread rapidly once political and social conditions permitted. The seeds of religious upheaval established during this period would later erupt into open confrontation as reformist leaders gained allies among the nobility and urban populations. The combination of institutional wealth, intellectual ferment, and social tension created a paradox. The church was simultaneously powerful and vulnerable, capable of shaping society while unable to prevent the dissemination of ideas that would ultimately challenge its authority and transform the kingdom. This tension set the stage for the Reformation and the profound political and cultural shifts that followed. By the late 1550s, Scotland was poised for a dramatic religious transformation. The Scottish Reformation, fueled by the dissemination of Calvinist theology, gained momentum among both urban populations and influential nobles dissatisfied with the economic, political, and moral authority of the Catholic Church. Reformers such as John Knox articulated a vision of religious governance emphasizing scripture, communal discipline, and a rejection of hierarchical clerical privilege. Knox and his allies effectively combined preaching, pamphleteering, and political negotiation to mobilize support, transforming what had been sporadic criticism into a coordinated movement capable of reshaping the kingdom's spiritual and political landscape. The death of Mary of Guise in 1560 removed a critical defender of Catholic authority in Scotland. As regent for her daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, Guise had relied on French military and diplomatic support to maintain ecclesiastical dominance. With her passing, the reformist movement faced diminished opposition at the highest levels of governance, providing an opportunity for decisive action. The Scottish Parliament responded by formally abolishing papal authority and approving a Protestant confession of faith, known as the Scots Confession, in August 1560. This legislative act effectively institutionalized religious reform, embedding Calvinist principles into national law and asserting the Crown's capacity to redefine the kingdom's spiritual framework independently of Rome. The Reformation involved not only political maneuvering, but also armed conflict and social upheaval. Iconoclasm swept through towns and religious houses, targeting altars, images, and relics associated with Catholic practice. Reformist militias seized control of strategic churches and abbeys, while nobles aligned with Knox's movement exerted influence over both urban centers and rural territories. Contemporary accounts describe these events as both religious and political, illustrating how reform was inseparable from ongoing struggles over national sovereignty and foreign influence. Scotland's proximity to France and England made the Reformation a matter of international significance, as each power sought to shape the kingdom's religious and political orientation. Institutionally, the Scottish Reformation rejected the episcopal hierarchy characteristic of continental Catholicism. The establishment of a Presbyterian church introduced a system of governance led by elected elders and ministers, accountable to congregations rather than distant bishops. This structure emphasized collective oversight, moral discipline, and local accountability, reshaping societal norms and expectations. Parishes and presbyteries became central points of civic as well as spiritual authority, regulating behavior, education, and charitable activity. The new system strengthened the integration of religious practice with local governance, while reducing the capacity of any single clerical figure to dominate public life. Economic and social factors further facilitated rapid adoption. The redistribution of former monastic lands provided material incentives to nobles and urban elites, aligning their interests with the reformist cause. Simultaneously, the spread of literacy, printing, and urban networks allowed Calvinist ideas to circulate quickly, reaching populations that had previously been peripheral to elite clerical discourse. Parliamentary records, municipal accounts, and correspondence reveal the speed and efficiency with which reformist policies were implemented, demonstrating that ideological change was reinforced by practical governance and local support. The Scottish Reformation succeeded where earlier dissent had struggled because it combined theology, political opportunity, and popular mobilization. By integrating religious reform with legal enactment, social enforcement, and strategic negotiation with influential nobles, the movement rapidly dismantled Catholic authority and established a lasting Protestant framework. However, the new religious order also introduced enduring tensions within the monarchy. The crown now faced the challenge of reigning over a society in which ecclesiastical authority was decentralized, empowered local communities, and occasionally opposed royal preference, setting the stage for continuing negotiation between king, church, and nobility in the decades to follow. Mary, Queen of Scots, returned to Scotland from France in 1561 as a young monarch shaped by Catholic upbringing and the French court's political sophistication. Her personal faith immediately set her apart in a kingdom that had officially embraced Protestantism under the Scottish Reformation. Initially, Mary pursued a policy of cautious tolerance, seeking to accommodate the newly established Presbyterian Church while maintaining her own religious practices. This approach reflected both political pragmatism and personal conviction, but it quickly proved difficult to sustain amid the factionalism of Scottish politics, where noble alliances and regional loyalties often superseded royal intention. Mary's reign was marked by a series of dynastic and political challenges that eroded her authority. Her marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, initially intended to consolidate her claim and unite Catholic and Protestant factions, became a source of scandal and tension. Darnley's personal ambition, combined with his participation in court intrigue, destabilized royal governance. The murder of Darnley in 1567, followed by Mary's subsequent marriage to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of involvement in Darnley's death, provoked rebellion among powerful nobles. These events illustrated the precarious balance of personal agency, dynastic expectation, and political necessity in a kingdom where religious alignment increasingly dictated loyalty and legitimacy. Mary's inability to reconcile her Catholic faith with the Protestant establishment culminated in her forced abdication in favor of her infant son, James VI, in 1567. The regency government that followed operated within the parameters of the Presbyterian Church, consolidating Protestant authority and limiting the crown's capacity to assert independent religious or political policy. Mary's imprisonment in Lochleven Castle, her subsequent flight to England, and her decades-long captivity reflect the intertwining of religious and dynastic conflict on a national and international stage. Her presence in England became a focal point for Catholic plots against Elizabeth I, further complicating Anglo-Scottish relations and reinforcing the perception that her faith rendered her politically dangerous. The execution of Mary in 1587 internationalized Scotland's religious divisions, transforming a domestic struggle into a matter of European concern. Her life and death illustrate the intersection of gender, personal belief, and political legitimacy in a reformed kingdom. As a female monarch, Mary faced heightened scrutiny and limited latitude to navigate the contentious religious landscape, while her Catholicism directly challenged the prevailing Protestant consensus. Contemporary chronicles, diplomatic correspondence, and legal records reveal that her downfall was as much a product of factional rivalry and dynastic insecurity as it was of confessional difference, highlighting the multifaceted pressures on rulers during periods of religious transformation. Mary's reign demonstrates how personal conviction could conflict with structural and societal changes in a kingdom redefining its identity. Her inability to maintain authority over a divided nobility and reconcile her faith with the Protestant settlement resulted in her political isolation and eventual exile. At the same time, her continued symbolic presence shaped the strategies of Protestant leaders and the policies of her son, James VI, reinforcing the importance of religious alignment for the crown's legitimacy. The downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots, ultimately cleared the path for a Protestant succession and the consolidation of a reformed monarchy. By removing a monarch whose personal faith conflicted with national religious settlement, the kingdom stabilized under regents and advisors aligned with the Presbyterian Church. This transition facilitated the eventual unification of crowns under James VI, whose reign would bridge the Scottish and English thrones while maintaining Protestant religious governance, establishing a framework for political and religious continuity in the decades to follow. James VI ascended the Scottish throne as an infant in 1567 following the abdication of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, and his early reign was dominated by regents navigating the complex religious and political landscape of post-Reformation Scotland. Raised within a Protestant framework, James received rigorous education emphasizing governance, law, and theology, preparing him to assert authority over both the crown and the Presbyterian Church. He inherited a kingdom in which the monarchy had been tempered by the influence of powerful nobles and a church resistant to episcopal control. As king, James worked to consolidate royal power while negotiating the delicate balance with the Presbyterian hierarchy, seeking to maintain religious conformity without provoking widespread resistance. The political trajectory of James's reign took a decisive turn with the death of Elizabeth I of England in 1603, which positioned him as the heir to the English throne. The union of the crowns brought Scotland and England under a single monarch, yet the governments remained separate, with Scotland retaining its own legal, ecclesiastical, and parliamentary institutions. James's court relocated primarily to London, reducing the daily presence of the king in Edinburgh and diminishing Scotland's direct influence over royal decision-making. While symbolically significant, the union exposed the structural limitations of Scottish political power and increased reliance on personal diplomacy and patronage to maintain influence. Parliamentary and court records indicate that Scottish commissioners and advisors had to navigate this distance carefully, often negotiating access to the monarch while preserving domestic authority. James sought to strengthen the monarchy by promoting the concept of divine kingship, asserting that royal authority was sanctioned by God and transcended local or parliamentary challenge. His writings, including Basilican Doran, emphasized obedience, hierarchical governance, and the sanctity of the crown, providing ideological justification for centralization and extending the monarch's reach into ecclesiastical and civil affairs. In Scotland, James attempted to impose episcopal structures within the church to align with his vision of uniformity and control, encountering resistance from Presbyterian ministers and local congregations. These tensions illustrate the persistent friction between royal ambition and Scotland's established religious institutions, foreshadowing the conflicts that would intensify in the 17th century. The union of the crowns also transformed Scotland's position within the British Isles. By sharing a monarch with England, Scotland gained indirect influence on continental diplomacy and access to English resources, but it also faced new limitations. Political attention increasingly centered on London, where English domestic concerns dominated the court's agenda. Scottish representatives and nobles had to cultivate networks of influence within the English court while ensuring the maintenance of domestic governance, a dual responsibility that complicated internal administration and fiscal policy. Legislative records reveal efforts to protect Scottish laws and institutions, but the practical impact of physical absence and diminished direct influence was significant, requiring ongoing negotiation between crown and estates. James's reign demonstrates the paradox of dynastic expansion. Gaining the English crown enhanced the prestige and strategic positioning of Scotland, yet simultaneously reduced its political leverage. The monarch's focus on unifying religious practice and asserting royal authority created ideological and institutional frameworks that would influence succession, parliamentary relations, and religious policy in both kingdoms. Scottish independence in governance was preserved legally but challenged practically, highlighting the complexity of shared monarchy without full political union. The accession of James VI to the English throne reshaped Scotland's sovereignty and foreshadowed a century of political and religious tension. While the union of the crowns symbolized dynastic success and expanded Scotland's international standing, it also created structural limitations, regional disparities, and ideological conflicts that would dominate 17th-century politics. This period laid the groundwork for debates over royal authority, religious conformity, and national identity that continued under James's successors, illustrating how dynastic change can simultaneously confer power and constrain it within evolving institutional frameworks. In the 17th century, Scotland faced a series of intertwined political and religious crises that tested the resilience of its institutions and the authority of the crown. The accession of Charles I brought renewed tension as the king sought to enforce episcopal forms of worship across Scotland, challenging the Presbyterian settlement established during the Reformation. Resistance to these measures coalesced in the National Covenant of 1638, a compact signed by nobles, clergy, and common citizens alike to defend Scotland's religious traditions and assert the principle of local ecclesiastical autonomy. The covenant represented not only a theological statement, but also a declaration of political agency, linking faith with national identity and reinforcing the capacity of collective action to challenge royal authority. The Covenanting movement triggered the Bishops' Wars, 1639 to 1640, in which Scottish armies mobilized to resist royal imposition. These conflicts, though limited in scale compared to later civil wars, demonstrated Scotland's military capacity and organizational coherence. Scottish forces, drawing upon regional levies and trained bands, operated with a level of coordination that reflected both communal commitment and strategic acumen. Nevertheless, the involvement in broader conflicts, including the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, extended Scotland's military engagement into England and Ireland, creating complex webs of alliance and opposition. Shifting loyalties among Scottish nobles, who balanced religious convictions with pragmatic concerns about land, titles, and influence, added further volatility to the political landscape. The execution of Charles I in 1649 represented a turning point for Scotland. While many Covenanters initially sought to negotiate terms preserving both monarchy and Presbyterian governance, the king's death forced the nation to confront the implications of republican authority. Scotland's subsequent alignment with Charles II and participation in military campaigns against Cromwell's forces culminated in defeat, leading to the incorporation of Scotland into the English Commonwealth. During this period, traditional Scottish institutions were suspended or subordinated, and the Crown's authority was replaced by military governance. Contemporary parliamentary records and correspondence from Scottish commanders document the strain on resources, widespread disruption to civic administration, and the challenges of maintaining cohesion under foreign-imposed structures. Repeated warfare placed enormous burdens on both the population and the state. Taxation, conscription, and resource requisitioning exhausted urban and rural communities, while prolonged campaigns disrupted trade, agriculture, and local governance. Despite these pressures, ideological commitment to Presbyterian principles and national autonomy remained a powerful motivating force, illustrating the centrality of religion to Scottish political identity. Yet the very efforts to defend ecclesiastical independence often undermined the broader stability of governance, highlighting the tension between moral or religious imperatives and practical political administration. The 17th century crisis demonstrates that the defense of religious autonomy, while essential to Scotland's self-definition, imposed severe structural and social costs. Military engagement abroad, fiscal strain, and factional disputes eroded the capacity of the state to manage domestic affairs effectively. Parliamentary debates, legal documents, and military correspondence from this period reveal the persistent negotiation between ideological commitment and the practical necessities of governance, illustrating the fragility of Scottish sovereignty in the face of external and internal pressures. The restoration of the monarchy in 1660 did not resolve these tensions. While Charles II's return reinstated the crown, unresolved disputes over church governance, noble authority, and legal prerogatives persisted. Scotland entered a period of cautious accommodation, in which the monarchy sought to reassert influence, while contending with the enduring legacies of Covenanting ideology and military disruption. This environment of negotiated authority, lingering mistrust, and regional autonomy set the stage for subsequent debates over parliamentary union and the eventual loss of independent sovereignty, illustrating the long-term consequences of 17th-century religious and political crises. The period from the restoration of Charles II in 1660 to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89 was marked by both religious and economic turbulence in Scotland. The Crown sought to reassert control over ecclesiastical affairs by attempting to reimpose episcopacy, provoking unrest, particularly in the southwest, where Presbyterian communities resisted hierarchical oversight. Covenanter traditions remained deeply embedded, leading to clandestine worship, localized rebellions, and periodic crackdowns by royal authorities. These tensions underscored the persistent friction between central authority and popular religious commitment, demonstrating that political stability remained contingent on the negotiation of faith and governance. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 89 fundamentally altered the balance of power in Scotland. William of Orange's accession led to the Revolution settlement, which restored Presbyterianism as the established church, reaffirmed the supremacy of the Scottish Parliament, and codified the Protestant succession. Legal and parliamentary records show that these reforms entrenched constitutional principles that limited royal prerogative while providing continuity for governance. Although religious conflict diminished in intensity, the political framework reinforced parliamentary authority, creating a system in which the Crown's influence was mediated through negotiation with legislative and clerical bodies. Economic challenges compounded Scotland's political vulnerability during this period. Limited access to overseas colonial markets constrained trade and investment opportunities, while repeated harvest failures during the 1690s, known collectively as the Seven Ill Years, caused widespread famine and social distress. Contemporary accounts, including parish records and merchant correspondence, document severe food shortages, population displacement, and declining urban productivity. These crises weakened domestic confidence in both government and market systems, highlighting the fragility of Scotland's economic foundations. The Darien Scheme, 1698 to 1700, epitomized Scotland's aspirations and miscalculations in economic expansion. Scottish investors sought to establish a colony on the Isthmus of Panama to participate in Atlantic trade and secure a national mercantile foothold. Despite broad domestic support, the venture was poorly funded, inadequately prepared, and faced active opposition from English commercial interests. The failure of the colony resulted in catastrophic financial losses, bankrupting investors, draining national capital, and undermining confidence in Scotland's independent economic initiatives. Parliamentary and private financial records illustrate the scale of the loss, demonstrating how the collapse exposed Scotland's reliance on England for trade, credit, and maritime protection. These economic hardships had direct political consequences. Financial vulnerability increased pressure on elites to seek security through political alignment with England. Dependence on English trade networks, combined with the devastation of Darien and recurrent famine, created incentives for constitutional compromise as a means to safeguard both property and long-term stability. The crisis highlighted the interconnectedness of economic capacity and political autonomy. Without secure trade and investment, the feasibility of independent policy was severely constrained. By the end of the 17th century, Scotland's combination of religious settlement, parliamentary authority, and economic vulnerability created conditions in which political union with England became increasingly attractive to elites. The limitations of independent economic capacity, coupled with ongoing negotiation over ecclesiastical governance and parliamentary power, established the context in which the Acts of Union would later be conceived. Financial weakness and political pragmatism thus converged, making constitutional compromise appear not only desirable but necessary for the preservation of national stability and elite interests. The negotiation of the Acts of Union in 1707 represented the culmination of decades of political, economic, and religious developments that had increasingly constrained Scotland's independent capacity. Scottish commissioners entered discussions with England under considerable pressure. The economic devastation following the Darien Scheme, combined with recurring crop failures and limited access to colonial markets, created an urgent need for stability and investment. English negotiators sought to secure the Protestant succession, prevent potential foreign alliances, and integrate Scotland into a broader imperial framework. Both sides approached negotiations with clearly defined interests. Scotland sought economic relief and the preservation of key national institutions, while England prioritized security and the consolidation of dynastic union. Negotiations resulted in a compromise that preserved several aspects of Scottish national life while fundamentally altering political sovereignty. Scotland retained its legal system, its Presbyterian church, and its established educational institutions, ensuring continuity in domestic governance and cultural identity. Simultaneously, the Scottish Parliament was dissolved, and representation shifted to the newly formed Parliament of Great Britain, marking the end of independent legislative authority. Financial arrangements, including the equivalent payment, compensated Darien investors and assumed portions of national debt, while access to English colonial markets promised economic expansion and integration into Atlantic trade networks. These measures addressed immediate economic concerns while facilitating Scotland's incorporation into the British state. Despite these concessions, the Union faced significant resistance among the Scottish populace. Parliamentary debates, petitions, and widespread protests reveal that opposition extended across burghs, rural communities, and influential social networks. Many citizens viewed the surrender of an independent legislature as a profound loss of national sovereignty, while critics feared domination by English interests in political, economic, and cultural affairs. Pamphlets, sermons, and contemporary correspondence illustrate both the depth and breadth of dissent, highlighting the tension between elite negotiation and popular perception. The legal and procedural framework of the Union underscores that the act was accomplished through consent and statute rather than military imposition. Scottish commissioners engaged in detailed deliberations, drafting clauses that protected domestic institutions while aligning the kingdom with English interests. Parliamentary approval, although contested, provided a formal and recognized mechanism for the transfer of authority. Nonetheless, the resulting union represented a fundamental reconfiguration of governance. Legislative power shifted to a centralized parliament in London, and Scotland's capacity for autonomous political decision-making was dramatically curtailed. The Act of Union thus illustrates the complex interplay between economic necessity, political negotiation, and popular sentiment. Legal processes enabled the creation of a new political entity, yet the preservation of certain national institutions masked the underlying reality of lost sovereignty. Contemporary records reflect both the pragmatic calculations of elites seeking stability and the enduring resentment among communities perceiving dispossession. Scotland's integration into Great Britain established structural advantages and long-term economic opportunities, but also generated political and cultural anxieties that would resonate for centuries. On May 1, 1707, the Scottish Parliament formally ceased to exist, marking a decisive end to centuries of legislative independence. The Union demonstrated that constitutional change could be achieved through negotiation and statute rather than conquest, yet it fundamentally transformed the relationship between Scotland and its neighbors. While legal frameworks safeguarded elements of national identity, the political shift created enduring debates over representation, governance, and autonomy. The Act of Union set the stage for the 18th century, defining the contours of Scotland's economic, political, and social integration into the emerging British state and laying the foundation for future discussions of sovereignty and national identity. The Union of 1707 fundamentally altered Scotland's economic landscape, providing a framework for engagement with the British Empire that reshaped trade, investment, and societal structures. Although the Scottish Parliament had ceased to exist, the integration into a larger political and commercial system opened access to English colonial markets and imperial capital. Scottish merchants quickly recognized these opportunities, establishing networks across the Atlantic that facilitated trade in tobacco, sugar, and later cotton. Glasgow, in particular, emerged as a central hub for transatlantic commerce. By the mid-18th century, the city's merchant class had developed extensive connections in North America and the Caribbean, managing imports of raw materials and exports of manufactured goods, demonstrating how political integration enabled unprecedented economic expansion. Ports such as Greenock, Leith, and Aberdeen expanded significantly to accommodate increasing trade volumes. Investments in harbor facilities, warehouses, and shipping fleets enabled faster, more reliable movement of goods. Inland infrastructure also evolved. New roads, canals, and river improvements connected agricultural regions to urban centers and international markets. The Forth and Clyde Canal, completed in 1790, exemplified this integration, linking eastern and western ports and facilitating the movement of coal, grain, and manufactured goods. Economic records from port authorities and municipal ledgers document a surge in shipping activity, demonstrating the transformation of Scotland from a regional economy to a participant in global commerce. Agricultural improvement paralleled urban and commercial development. Landowners introduced enclosure, crop rotation, and selective breeding, increasing yields and generating surpluses suitable for trade. These innovations modernized rural production but also displaced many small tenants and cotters, forcing them to seek employment in towns or migrate abroad. Estate records and parish accounts reveal the scale of these social shifts. While elite landlords and commercial farmers benefited, many rural communities experienced significant disruption, highlighting the uneven consequences of economic modernization. The integration into empire also stimulated financial development. Merchants and investors accumulated capital that could be reinvested in shipping, manufacturing, and infrastructure. Banking institutions in Edinburgh and Glasgow expanded, offering credit and insurance mechanisms essential for long-distance trade. Insurance records, ledger books, and correspondence between trading houses indicate a growing sophistication in financial operations, demonstrating how Scotland's economy increasingly relied on complex networks of risk management and investment. Cultural and social effects accompanied these economic transformations. Wealthy merchant families influenced urban development, philanthropy, and civic life, funding schools, hospitals, and cultural institutions. The growth of literacy, numeracy, and commercial expertise among urban populations created a skilled workforce capable of supporting industrial and mercantile expansion. Simultaneously, rural depopulation and urban migration began to reshape community structures, as traditional patterns of landholding and labor were disrupted by enclosure and commercial pressures. Integration into the British imperial economy illustrates that Scotland's industrial development did not occur in isolation. Access to colonial markets and capital, combined with domestic improvements in agriculture and infrastructure, generated the conditions for sustained economic growth. Yet this prosperity was uneven, concentrated in urban centers and among elites, while many rural populations experienced displacement and marginalization. Contemporary economic records and municipal accounts demonstrate the dual character of this transformation, the creation of opportunity alongside social dislocation. The opening of imperial markets and accumulation of capital laid the foundation for Scotland's industrial revolution in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Commercial expansion, infrastructure investment, and agricultural improvement provided both the resources and human capital necessary for industrial growth. At the same time, the uneven distribution of benefits highlighted emerging social tensions that would shape labor relations, urban development, and political debate in the decades to follow, illustrating how global economic integration transformed Scotland from a peripheral kingdom into a dynamic participant in the British Empire. By the late 18th century, Scotland had entered a phase of rapid industrialization that would redefine its economy, society, and urban landscape. Coal mining in the Central Belt supplied energy to emerging industries, while iron production and shipbuilding supported both domestic infrastructure and Britain's expanding naval power. Textile manufacturing, particularly in linen and cotton, became a cornerstone of industrial employment in cities such as Dundee and Paisley. Glasgow, benefiting from its port and commercial networks, transformed into a major industrial metropolis. Factory records, municipal archives, and census data indicate a dramatic increase in urban population, fueled by migration from rural Scotland and Ireland. These shifts concentrated labor in dense urban centers, creating both economic opportunity and social challenges. Working conditions during industrialization were often harsh and hazardous. Coal miners faced dangerous subterranean environments. Textile workers endured long hours in poorly ventilated mills, and shipyard laborers were exposed to heavy materials and repetitive injury. Housing infrastructure lagged behind population growth, resulting in overcrowded tenements with limited sanitation. Contemporary accounts, including parish reports and personal correspondence, document the health risks and daily hardships endured by the working population. Despite these challenges, industrial employment fostered new social forms and networks. Communities of workers developed shared identities based on occupation and locality, which contributed to early labor organization, mutual aid societies, and nascent political activism advocating for improved conditions and representation. Education expanded in parallel with industrial growth. Parish schools and charitable institutions provided basic literacy and numeracy, equipping a new generation with skills necessary for employment in engineering, manufacturing, and commerce. Technical knowledge became increasingly valued, supporting scientific and engineering innovation that in turn reinforced industrial productivity. Educational reform and access illustrate the interplay between social development and economic modernization, demonstrating that industrial success relied not only on capital and resources, but also on human skill and adaptability. The industrial transformation linked local labor to global processes. Scotland's coal, iron, textiles, and ships were integral to British imperial commerce, contributing to naval capacity, colonial expansion, and overseas trade networks. Urban centers became nodes within a broader imperial system, connecting Scottish workers' labor to the functioning and projection of British power. Records of shipping, industrial output, and trade flows highlight the scale of Scotland's integration into global markets, emphasizing the reciprocal relationship between local industrialization and imperial ambition. While industrialization generated unprecedented wealth and technological advancement, it also intensified social inequalities. Rural depopulation, urban overcrowding, and exploitation of labor created conditions ripe for political debate, social reform movements, and labor activism. Workers' experiences of economic growth were inseparable from the hardships of daily life, fostering collective consciousness and early forms of organization that sought to mitigate structural inequities. Contemporary newspapers, pamphlets, and union records reveal the tension between industrial opportunity and social strain, illustrating how rapid economic development reshaped both society and identity. Scotland's industrial cities became engines of production, innovation, and imperial support, but their growth came with profound human costs. By concentrating labor, capital, and technical expertise, industrialization transformed Scotland into one of Europe's most dynamic regions, linking local communities to global economic and political networks. The expansion of urban labor and the emergence of collective consciousness established the foundation for subsequent social, political, and cultural developments, demonstrating that industrial growth was inseparable from both opportunity and challenge, prosperity and strain. Industrialization profoundly reshaped Scottish society, producing both disruption and adaptation across social, political, and cultural dimensions. One of the most dramatic changes was the Highland clearances, which accelerated from the late 18th century. Landlords, seeking higher profits from sheep farming, forcibly evicted thousands of tenants from traditional holdings. Families were displaced to coastal settlements, lowland towns, or compelled to emigrate to England, North America, and Australasia. Parish records, estate documents, and contemporary accounts attest to widespread hardship. Yet these movements also spread Scottish communities, traditions, and labor across the globe, creating enduring diasporic networks. Urbanization and industrial employment fostered new political consciousness. Workers, concentrated in cities and industrial centers, increasingly organized to demand improved conditions, representation, and suffrage. Movements such as Chartism gained traction in mid-19th century Scotland, advocating for universal male suffrage, secret ballots, and equitable electoral representation. Later, trade unions and emerging labor parties provided institutional frameworks for worker advocacy, linking economic grievances to political reform. These movements illustrate the direct connection between industrial transformation and the development of modern civic engagement. Cultural responses to industrial and social change also emerged during this period. Antiquarians, historians, and writers sought to preserve and celebrate Highland traditions, Gaelic language, and clan histories, often romanticizing the past while adapting it to contemporary sensibilities. Walter Scott's literary works exemplify this cultural revival, presenting a narrative that blended historical scholarship with imaginative reconstruction. Museums, learned societies, and publications disseminated knowledge of Scotland's heritage, fostering national pride within a British imperial context. This revival reinforced identity even as industrial modernity altered social and geographic landscapes. Education reforms and civic institutions further shaped social adaptation. Parish schools, technical institutes, and philanthropic organizations expanded access to literacy, numeracy, and vocational skills, supporting both economic participation and civic responsibility. Curricula emphasized moral improvement alongside practical instruction, reflecting a broader ethos of social progress. Schools and civic initiatives became arenas for cultivating a sense of national identity, blending Scottish heritage with loyalty to a modernizing British state. The combination of displacement, political activism, and cultural preservation demonstrates Scotland's complex negotiation with industrial modernity. Social protest, exemplified by labor movements and reform campaigns, reflected the immediate pressures of economic change, while cultural revival and educational initiatives provided a framework for collective memory and identity. This dual response enabled communities to navigate dislocation, integrate into urban industrial life, and maintain a sense of historical continuity. As Scotland's industrial dominance peaked in the late 19th century and subsequently faced economic challenges, the foundations established in this era, diaspora networks, labor organization, and cultural identity, prepared the nation for the uncertainties of the modern age. The interplay between industrial growth, social protest, and cultural revival illustrates how Scotland adapted to profound economic and demographic transformation while actively reshaping its historical memory, laying the groundwork for political, social, and cultural developments in the 20th century. The first half of the 20th century was a period of profound transformation for Scotland, shaped by global conflict and structural economic change. Scottish industry proved vital during both world wars, with shipbuilding along the Clyde, steel production in Lanarkshire, and munitions factories across urban centers supplying the Allied war effort. These industries not only sustained national defense, but also stimulated employment and technological innovation. Government contracts and wartime investment temporarily bolstered urban economies, yet the underlying industrial base remained fragile, heavily reliant on traditional heavy industries with limited diversification. The interwar period exposed these vulnerabilities starkly. Declining demand for coal, steel, and shipbuilding led to widespread unemployment, particularly in Glasgow, Dundee, and other industrial towns. Overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and limited social services intensified the effects of economic contraction, creating a pronounced urban poverty that contrasted with Scotland's wartime contributions. Contemporary reports, census data, and municipal records document the social strain experienced by working-class families, highlighting the challenges of economic dependency on aging industries and the uneven impact of national policy on local communities. Post-1945, the expansion of the welfare state sought to address these structural weaknesses and transform living standards. Housing reforms replaced slum tenements with council estates, while the establishment of the National Health Service improved access to medical care across urban and rural Scotland. Education reforms, including expanded secondary schooling and vocational training, aim to equip a workforce capable of adapting to a more diversified and technologically advanced economy. Nationalization of key industries, including coal, steel, and transport, reflected government attempts to stabilize employment, ensure investment, and maintain strategic capacity. While these measures improved material conditions for many, they also brought cultural dislocation as communities tied to traditional industries faced identity shifts and occupational change. Employment and census records illustrate a dual narrative of progress and loss. Families gained improved health, housing, and education, Yet the decline of industries that had long defined Scottish economic and social life produced a sense of uncertainty. Urban redevelopment projects, while modernizing infrastructure, sometimes displaced communities and eroded long-standing neighborhood networks. The social fabric of industrial Scotland, built over centuries of labor, migration, and communal life, was fundamentally altered even as standards of living improved. Scotland's wartime contributions, juxtaposed with the collapse of its industrial foundations, underscore the paradox of modern transformation. National importance and global engagement coincided with local economic vulnerability. Material gains from welfare and reconstruction programs were inseparable from the challenges of economic restructuring and identity adaptation. Communities that had defined themselves through shipbuilding, steel, and coal production now faced the realities of deindustrialization and the need for social and occupational mobility. This era illustrates the interconnectedness of global events, industrial capacity, and social policy. Scotland's participation in global conflict reinforced its strategic and economic significance, while peacetime revealed the limits of industrial dependency. Government intervention through welfare expansion, planning, and nationalization mitigated hardship, but could not fully restore the industrial structures that had historically underpinned national identity. The experience of the first half of the 20th century set the stage for debates over political representation, regional autonomy, and economic strategy, linking material conditions to emerging questions about Scotland's place within the United Kingdom and the wider world. From the mid-20th century onward, Scotland experienced a growing tension between centralized governance and regional political identity. Decision-making increasingly concentrated in London, with Westminster controlling economic policy, taxation, and industrial strategy. This centralization, combined with the decline of traditional industries such as shipbuilding, coal, and steel, fostered a perception that Scottish interests were subordinated to broader UK priorities. Communities experiencing economic hardship often felt alienated from national decision-making, generating political dissatisfaction that manifested in voting patterns and public discourse. Parliamentary debates, policy analyses, and contemporaneous media coverage highlight the depth of this disconnect, revealing an emerging sense that Scotland required greater autonomy to manage its affairs effectively. Economic shifts during this period reinforced political divergence. The discovery and development of North Sea oil in the 1970s provided a potential resource for national revenue and economic planning, sparking debates over who should control these assets. Advocates for home rule and devolution argued that local management of resources could support economic development, fund social programs, and redress historical disparities caused by centralized decision-making. Opponents, particularly within the UK government, emphasized shared sovereignty and the risks of fiscal fragmentation. Archival records from government commissions, oil industry analyses, and parliamentary hearings demonstrate how resource discovery became intertwined with questions of political authority and democratic legitimacy. The political landscape of Scotland shifted further during the late 20th century, particularly in response to the Thatcher government's policies in the 1980s. Industrial closures, cuts to social spending, and centralized economic reform heightened tensions between Scottish public opinion and Westminster policy. Electoral data from the period show increasing support for the Labour Party, the Scottish National Party, SNP, and other parties advocating greater institutional autonomy. Social democratic ideals, rooted in welfare expansion, labor organization, and equitable economic policy, became dominant in Scottish political culture, diverging sharply from conservative trends in England. These developments underscore the interplay between economic experience, social values, and political alignment. Attempts to institutionalize regional governance reflected both these pressures and the limitations of central authority. The 1979 devolution referendum, although ultimately unsuccessful due to the requirement for a supermajority, revealed significant public support for a Scottish legislature with powers over domestic policy and resource management. Policy reports, campaign materials, and voter records illustrate both enthusiasm for devolution and the complex negotiation between legal frameworks and popular will. While the referendum's failure delayed structural reform, it established a foundation for continued advocacy and political mobilization. By the late 20th century, Scotland had developed a distinct political identity characterized by demands for self-governance, social democratic policy preferences, and skepticism towards centralized control. Archival evidence, voting patterns, and party platforms demonstrate a sustained divergence from UK-wide consensus driven by historical experience, economic restructuring, and resource-based debates. These developments reflected a cumulative process in which economic, social, and political factors converged to produce a uniquely Scottish approach to representation and governance. Persistent demands for autonomy, informed by both economic imperatives and political culture, would ultimately reshape the constitutional settlement. The combination of regional identity, resource awareness, and civic engagement created momentum for formal devolution, setting the stage for Scotland's entry into a new era of political self-determination and institutional reform at the close of the 20th century. The final decades of the 20th century and the early 21st century witnessed Scotland achieving a measure of political autonomy through devolution while remaining constitutionally part of the United Kingdom. Following growing public support and sustained advocacy, the 1997 referendum established the framework for a Scottish Parliament, which officially convened in 1999. Devolved powers included education, health, transportation, and aspects of domestic policy, enabling Scotland to legislate on matters directly affecting its population. The establishment of this legislature represented both a response to historical grievances over centralized governance and a practical mechanism for regional decision-making. Legislative records, electoral data, and parliamentary debates from this period illustrate how devolution created institutions capable of addressing local needs while operating within the constitutional framework of the Union. Devolution also reignited conversations about national identity and sovereignty. The early 21st century saw renewed advocacy for full independence, culminating in the 2014 referendum. During the campaign, arguments ranged from economic control and resource management to cultural preservation and international representation. Despite robust debate and high voter engagement, the majority opted to remain within the United Kingdom. Detailed polling data, campaign materials, and post-referendum analyses demonstrate that while independence was not realized, the process reinforced civic participation, political awareness, and institutional legitimacy within Scotland. Subsequent developments, particularly the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union in 2016, introduced new constitutional questions. Scotland had voted predominantly to remain in the EU, highlighting divergence between regional and national political preferences. Brexit reinforced discussions regarding autonomy, international alignment, and the limits of devolution, demonstrating that contemporary Scottish governance operates within multiple overlapping jurisdictions and pressures. Policy analyses and parliamentary records show ongoing negotiation between Scottish priorities and UK-wide authority, reflecting both the capacities and constraints of devolved governance. Cultural identity during this period continued to evolve alongside political institutions. Language revitalization initiatives, including the promotion of Gaelic and Scots, complemented broader efforts to celebrate Scottish heritage, literature, and historical memory. Diasporic networks, international cultural institutions, and global media engagement expanded the reach of Scottish identity beyond domestic borders. Educational curricula, civic programs, and cultural festivals illustrate how historical knowledge and contemporary pride coalesce, fostering a sense of nationhood that transcends formal sovereignty while grounding it in historical continuity. Modern Scotland exemplifies the coexistence of institutional authority and constitutional limitation. Devolved powers allow for substantial legislative autonomy, economic planning, and social policy innovation, yet ultimate sovereignty remains with the UK Parliament. The interplay between political authority, public expectation, and historical consciousness demonstrates that Scotland's modern identity is defined by both its achievements and its constraints. Contemporary governance, civic engagement, and cultural affirmation highlight a nation negotiating self-determination within a complex constitutional framework. The experience of devolution in contemporary Scottish politics underscores continuity with the past. Debates over representation, autonomy, and national identity echo centuries of negotiation between central authority and local self-determination. While full sovereignty remains unrealized, Scotland possesses robust institutions, active civic participation, and a globally recognized cultural presence. This period illustrates how historical experience informs modern governance, showing that a nation can assert political autonomy and maintain a distinctive identity even when formal independence is limited, continuing the trajectory of adaptation and resilience established over millennia.